all so much for coming. My name is Saad Kassem, and I'm a doctoral researcher here at the International State Crime Initiative and the convener of the State Crime Seminar Series. Before we begin, I'd just like to really thank the leadership of the International State Crime Initiative, Professor Penny Green, Dr. Thomas McManus, who are not here with us today, Fatima Kanji, and of course, Dr. Louise Weiss in the back, who has really been extremely helpful and supportive throughout the State Crime Seminar Series. Before we begin, I just kind of want to highlight exactly what it is we do here at the International State Crime Initiative and what state crime is and why it's important. So we focus really on state crime, which our definition of state crime is state organizational deviance violating human rights. So when you think of that, think of the coercive instruments of the state, whether it's the police, the security services, the intelligence services, the prison system, and also including in that, we're also thinking here of the tax system, because that also factors into the calculus in creating structures of oppression. We also, what's tremendously important for us here at the State Crime Initiative is civil resistance to state crime. Movements from below that expose criminality. So what we're focusing on is really unmasking the crimes of the powerful, through civil resistance movements. And that's important, and that's part and parcel of why we're all here together today, because we want to keep the momentum moving in the Truth for Giulio campaign. What I want to kind of also emphasize is that, as tragic as Giulio's death has been for most of us who are working on Egypt, it's important to be mindful that we can really all collectively make a difference here. We're here for a reason, for a purpose, so please feel free, as you hear the messages today from Anne and from Shane, please feel free to take a moment, to tweet out. The world is really listening. And when you leave here, please connect with your friends, share the messages, go back into your communities, your schools, your places of work, and spread the message. And we do have certain placards over here. And Anne and Shane have proposed that, at the end of the meeting, if you're interested, only if you are interested and if you feel comfortable, that we actually take, a group photo, and kind of use it as a platform to raise awareness, critical awareness about this issue. Now on to our speakers for today. I'm really delighted to introduce Anne Alexander, Dr. Anne Alexander, and Shane. Anne has been, a great friend of the International State Crime Initiative. She's the coordinator of the Digital Humanities Network at Cambridge, and she's been involved with this campaign since its inception. She put together a 4,600 page signature call for action at the very beginning, and that really kind of helped generate awareness. And another thing I should mention about Anne is that she has a wonderful book on independent labor movements called Bread, Freedom, and Social Justice, which really provides you with penetrating insights into, kind of the neoliberal structures in Egypt and all of that. And Shane Enright from Amnesty has also been, very, very effective on many levels, as a trade union campaigner, both locally and globally. And their research at Amnesty really has been terrific. So please help me in welcoming both and Edge.
Thanks very much, Simon. Thank you for both for your introduction and also for hosting us at the State Crime Initiative. We're very pleased to be here. And as Shane will explain in a bit more detail, this is part of a whole series of meetings that are taking place around the country, which began back in February this year, marking the anniversary of Giulio's disappearance and murder, where we've had up and down the country gatherings like this one with speakers and photo actions, raising the issues around forced disappearances in general in Egypt, and particularly, obviously, Giulio's case. So we're very pleased to be here today. Where I wanted to start, though, was to explain, in a sense, two reasons that have brought me personally to speak to you today. One of which is because Giulio was a colleague of mine at Cambridge. I didn't know him personally very well, but we met. We actually worked in the same building in Cambridge. He was a PhD student in the Centre for Development Studies, which is based upstairs in the building where my own post is based. And we also shared research interests in common. His PhD was looking at the development of independent workers' unions in Egypt, and that's something, as Saad mentioned, that I've written about. The book that Saad mentioned, I co-authored, in fact, with an Egyptian colleague. And so, for me, there's a connection at that level. But it's also something where this personal connection, in terms of my having met Giulio through my work, connected with something that I've been involved with as an activist for a long time. For the last since 2011, I've been involved with a network made up of activists from the UK trade unions called Middle East North Africa Solidarity Network, which publishes this magazine at the moment. And that has been working around issues in relation to solidarity with people fighting for social justice and democratic rights in Egypt since 2011. And in 2014, we helped to launch a specific campaign around Egypt which broadened the question of fighting for democratic and civil rights and against human rights violations from beyond the previous remit that we had, that was quite focused on issues around social justice and the labour movement, to take on the question of the emerging counter-revolution and massive human rights violations across the whole spectrum of the opposition to the military government that had come in following the coup of 2013. And this comes back to Giulio, of course, because Giulio was not alone in what happened to him. He's one of hundreds of people, thousands of people actually, who've been disappeared, thousands of people who've been tortured, and sadly hundreds of people who've been killed, either directly in these kinds of circumstances, or who've died as a result of neglect and so on in the prison system, or because of the bad treatment that they've received. Most of those deaths, torture, and human rights violations, despite the very important work of organisations like Amnesty and also local human rights organisations in Egypt, didn't generate the same amount of headlines in the international news as Giulio's death did. However, that was recognised, that the fact that Giulio and these Egyptians shared a common fate has very much been recognised by Giulio's family. I believe it was his mother who said of Giulio, they killed him like an Egyptian. And I think that's actually a very fitting way to put it. So I want to speak a bit really about not just about the specifics of Giulio's case, but what the case can tell us about the situation in Egypt and what light it sheds on the tensions and stresses that the regime is under today, as well as coming at the end to talk about the question of what we can do here. So there are two aspects of this that I'd like to focus on. One is the question of who is likely to have killed him, and what does that tell us about the nature of the regime that's in power at the moment. In a sense, this is a question about the kind of political context in which his murder took place. But then there's also the question of what made Giulio a target, and I think that relates, or that relates, likely to relate very much to the the work that he was doing as a researcher. And I should stress here, as far as I know, he wasn't an activist, he wasn't involved in politics. His work was of great political importance because he was very much cared about questions of social justice and understanding the world from the perspective of people who were oppressed and exploited. That comes clear, is clear from the work that he did. But he was a PhD student. He was there doing research as a PhD researcher, and wasn't, as far as I know, as far as any evidence has emerged of him being involved in any kind of political activism. But there was something about the work that he was doing which, although we can't be certain about this yet, is quite likely to have made him a target of suspicion and possibly being marked out for the horrific treatment he received. And that's to do with the questions he was trying to research about the social resistance to the neoliberal policy changes and reforms that are being pushed through in Egypt, both before the revolution in 2011 and now after. After the counter-revolution has gathered pace. So to return to the first question around what does the issue of who is likely to have killed him tell us about the Egyptian state and the context in Egypt today. This, I think, it's to come back to Saib's introduction. Although evidence and information about who is responsible for Giulio's murder has been slow to emerge into the public domain, right from the beginning, the manner of his disappearance and the types of torture and the prolonged nature of the torture that he suffered were immediately pinpointed both by local human rights organisations and by groups like Amnesty, which work extensively on issues around torture, as bearing the hallmarks of the Egyptian security forces. And as I said, they're part of a much wider pattern of forced disappearances. I won't take too long to speak about this because I think that Shane will I'm sure, touch on it, but Amnesty brought out last year a very important report on enforced disappearances in Egypt, which went through in detail after interviewing people who've been subject to disappearances, what happens when somebody is disappeared, and the period in which they are uncontactable by friends, by family, officially denied that they are anywhere in either police custody or anywhere under the purview of the security forces, is a period when horrific torture is very commonly meted out, and this is a pretty ubiquitous experience for Egyptians going through the security system, going through the judicial system. There has been a marked upturn in the number of disappearances over the last few years, despite the fact that there was, already very, very high levels of state violence, including the horrific violence that took place in the wake of the 2013 coup, when up to 1,000 people were killed in a day by the Egyptian security forces and army at Rabbi Adouya Square in Cairo, as a protest encampment of Mohamed Morsi's supporters, the supporters of the previous president who'd been overthrown by the coup, was cleared, and according to research from Human Rights Watch, around 1,000 people were killed that day. So, I mean, you're already talking about a very brutal context. But there's very clear evidence that the numbers, particularly this method of enforced disappearances, seizing people in the dead of night or walking down the street, making them disappear, torturing them in order to get them to confess to crimes, sometimes not even crimes, but confess to membership of organisations which the government has prescribed and so on, or sometimes to confess to actual crimes, has really accelerated. And you also have to put this in a context of, and this is very relevant to Giulio's case, increasingly kind of rampant fear being propagated by the security agencies, by the media that's supportive of the government, which is all the media is officially supportive of the government, creating a sense that spies may be there around every corner. This is particularly relevant in Giulio's case because there have been persistent efforts by the Egyptian media to sort of paint him as being some kind of a shady character, or suggest that he might have been involved in some sort of nefarious spying activities. And this is very much as part of a pattern of suggesting that foreign hands and foreign powers are interfering with Egypt's security, and a culture being promoted again by the security forces of encouraging people to become informers and make and give pass on rumours and gossip, or shock people to the authorities, and creating a really horrible atmosphere in which people are constantly looking over their shoulders. This is all important in the background, but I think it's crucial to set it into a bigger picture, because although you can trace back the kind of criminality and violence of the Egyptian state a very long way, you have to say that this state of these kind of actions by the security forces have got worse in recent years, precisely because of the revolution that took place in 2011, that needs to be seen as part of a bigger picture of actually a massive eruption of peaceful protest, and strikes on a huge scale in 2011, which forced Hosni Mubarak to step down. The state responded with massive violence again in that state, but for a while, for a very important short period of time, a couple of years, ordinary citizens were able to actually exercise their democratic rights much more freely. They were able to have elections took place, people were able to form trade unions and organise political parties. This is not something that was granted by the authorities, it was something that was taken by people going into the streets. And as I said, going into the streets, not in a clandestine way with a couple of bombs or attempting to assassinate top officials, but literally millions of people coming into the streets, organising themselves in strikes and sit-ins, like for example the sit-ins that took place in Tahrir Square, but also in workplaces across the country, turning the entire country into a place where ideas could be discussed, where people were actively thinking of themselves as citizens who could change the society they lived in. And this is absolutely anathema to the people who run Egypt for decades. It's the opposite of what the combined repressive weight of the institutions like the Ministry of the Interior, the army, the judiciary, the media, state-run media institutions. For them, the vision of Egypt is a society that they control from the top. They were desperate to put back into the box this genie that had been let out by ordinary people coming into the streets and expressing themselves. And so I think it's very important to set Giulio's death, his murder, into that context, that it's part of the wave of violence that accompanied. It was the counter-revolution that unfolded from 2012 into 2013, bringing the generals of the old regime back into much more overt control over the repressive institutions of the state. It's not that they'd ever gone anywhere in the sense that they hadn't been removed from power, but they had been pushed. The limits of what they could do, and certainly the limits of what the police could do, had been pushed back by the actions of ordinary people. It's very important not to, I think, fall into the trap of just seeing a continuum of, a level of state violence that has always been the same in Egypt. There was, for a period from 2011. There was definitely a period when those institutions and those practices were pushed onto the defensive, and people were able to express themselves. This is important, I think, then to come on to the second theme that I wanted to touch on about the importance of Giulio's research, because one of the reasons why the revolution took place in the first place, I would argue, is because it didn't simply address political issues. It also had a social soul. It took up the issues of social justice, and it was actively made up by millions of people involved in actions around defending their pay, defending their conditions at work, fighting for the right to organise as trade unionists in the workplace, raising issues about fixed-term contracts at work, challenging privatisation. There was a massive theme within the mobilisations in the labour movement and kind of more social campaigns before the revolution, challenging the privatisation process, and in fact stopping the privatisation process again for a few years. So while Giulio had, as I said, as far as I'm aware, no activist connections himself, and the people he was researching were, in a way, you would think it's surprising that generals and people who have at their command hundreds of thousands of soldiers could be afraid of independent trade unionists organising among some of the most oppressed and exploited sections of society. Giulio was he was researching street workers' unions, and that's people who sell goods in the streets, who are very marginalised and very vulnerable and oppressed. How is it that this huge state apparatus could be afraid of those kinds of people and what they represent, or be afraid of ordinary civil servants or rail workers? But they were, because they knew very well, I believe, that the strike waves that took place in the run-up to 2011 were a key factor in weakening the ability of the state to resist the protests when they really erupted in January, February, the 25th of January 2011. It was the ability of striking workers to shut down the transport system. Cairo's bus system, for example, shut down by strikes in the middle of the uprising against Mubarak. That the workers on the Suez Canal, servicing the Suez Canal, went out of strike. The general's own military factories went out on strike. Hundreds of thousands of workers had walked out in the days before Mubarak fell. And this is still a relevant issue, because the regime that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi runs has two aspects to it. It is a horrible apparatus of counter-revolutionary bloody violence, but it also has an economic agenda, has a very important role that it's playing on behalf of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and all of the governments of the UK and the EU, and at least and the US have all so far agreed with the prescriptions that they've been pushing through, which is to continue the privatisation process, to continue neoliberal austerity. So, for example, one of the direct threats that is faced by civil servants in Egypt at the moment is that Sisi has said, following again the prescriptions of the IMF and the World Bank, that he has to slim down the civil service. That means removing the job security for millions of workers who have very low paid but relatively secure jobs in public institutions in Egypt, in the different ministries, in education, in the health service, and so on. Sisi went on the record saying that we have, I think he said, we have 6 million civil servants, but we only really need 1 million. So he's essentially threatening the livelihoods and jobs of 5 million people and their families, and wants to do to the public sector what has already been done to large parts of the previously state-owned manufacturing sector over the past 20 years, which was to not necessarily to get rid of all of those jobs, because the country can't function without them, but to transfer them to the private sector and remove the kind of very minimal guarantees that they have of rights in terms of their contracts and their conditions at work and so on. And if you look at what's happened in the last 6 months or so in Egypt, again, what's interesting is, despite the incredible levels of repression against anyone who could be considered to be at all oppositional to the regime, or even could be imagined to harbour oppositional thoughts against the regime, is that there has been a marked upturn in the numbers of strikes and protests over social issues, over wages. One of the big drivers for this has been the agreement that the Egyptian government has signed for a loan from the International Monetary Fund, which has absolutely catastrophic consequences in terms of people's living standards. It's massively driven up inflation. So last time I looked, inflation was running about 30%. They've brought in a new value-added tax, which has then added a further further price rises. It's meant, for example, that medicines have been in such short supply that public hospitals have been turning patients away, saying that they can't treat them. It's meant that people have not been able to get access to the basic goods and services that they need. Again, according to the IMF, this pain is necessary in order to promote prosperity, but the entire experience of IMF-driven reforms over the last 20, 30 years has been the opposite. Instead, it has widened inequality. It has meant that wealth has spiraled upwards, which is great for Sisi and people from big business. The army is in fact a very important player in the Egyptian economy, so the generals are also businessmen owning factories, owning gas stations, owning large chunks of real estate. But for ordinary Egyptians, it's been catastrophic. So there's been a whole number of cases where striking workers have been attacked for going on strike. A number of important cases where trade unionists have been sacked or jailed, and so on. So this in a sense, I think, gives us an inkling as to why the research that Giulio was doing was important, and needs to be put into the context of another factor in understanding what happened to him. In terms of the latest, what we know about the latest developments in the case, as I said, for a long time there haven't been very much happening, but there has in the last few weeks been some news from his family, his mother and father, and the family lawyer in Italy have said that the Italian investigation into his murder has now come up with a list of names of 10 people who they believe were responsible for Giulio's murder, which has been presented to the Egyptian authorities. I mean, unfortunately, I don't read Italian, so I'm not up to date with the latest details in terms of the case in Italy. But certainly before Easter, there were, I think, negotiations going on, attempts from the Italian side to pressure the Egyptian authorities to pressure the Egyptian authorities to allow these people to be investigated, for their names to go forward, to be called for investigation. And Giulio's parents have been very, very clear, very explicit, that these are not random people. They're not a gang, for example, that as the Egyptian authorities claimed a year or so ago, they shot dead 5 people and said these were the people who kidnapped and killed Giulio. And coincidentally, they're all dead now, so you can't ask them anything about it. These are, from what was being reported in the media, these are security officials working in different security agencies who either were directly involved or had knowledge of what happened to Giulio. I mean, again, to refer back to the title of this seminar series, I believe Giulio's mother has been using the phrase saying this is a crime of the state. There is no doubt about this. To finish up, really, because I want to make sure that Shane has a chance to talk really about the campaign. I just want to focus on the question of the connections with both the UK and with Italy, the wider question of what we can do in terms of campaigning, but also in terms of what our government's roles and responsibilities are in cases like this. I mean, I think in the case of the UK, you can see it very clearly from two directions. We not only have a responsibility to campaign for truth and justice for Giulio, because he was a student at a British university, he was part of our academic community, but also because the British government has a long track record of supporting the Sisi regime. Sisi was invited and welcomed to Downing Street a couple of years ago, and it was after a period. It's not as if you're talking about a regime which is supposedly a pariah state. You're not talking about a regime like North Korea, which our governments is happy to condemn and so on. You're talking about a regime where its leaders are welcomed in, where there are high-level connections between our Home Office and the Ministry of the Interior in Egypt, and regular meetings. Now, why it was impossible for anyone in the Home Office, for example, to ask pertinent questions of their counterparts in Cairo about, responsibility and knowledge of what had happened to Giulio, given the depth of cooperation that takes place under the rubric of counter-terrorism, is a very good question to ask, and that's I think an added responsibility on us to campaign here and be involved actively in the campaign for truth for Giulio. So I'll leave it at that to make sure that Shane has plenty of time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. My name is Shane Enright. I'm Amnesty UK's trade union campaigner, but I'm also the global trade union advisor to the Amnesty movement. Let me say straight away, I'm not an Egypt expert. My mandate is global. However, the more time I spend with Anne, the more I feel like I'm becoming an expert. So thanks enormously for your lucid contribution, Anne, and certainly your analysis of the role of the labour movement and the workers' struggles in Egypt, I think absolutely hits the nail on the head and reminds us exactly why the state is so persistently repressive today. So I'm the case manager for the Giulio Regeni case in the UK. So that means that within Amnesty International, I'm the person responsible for both developing campaign strategies, campaign materials, but also for coordinating and sometimes disciplining some of our rather unruly constituencies in Amnesty UK in order that we get the most effective and impactful actions out there. In Amnesty UK we have a trade union network. I manage that trade union network. And we also have a student action network. This campaign is a collaboration between those two networks in Amnesty UK, but it's also, and this is very important and very welcome, it's also a partnership with the University and College Union, which represents 130,000 academics and other employees on campuses up and down the country. Now, the campaign for Giulio Regeni will continue until we get justice for him and accountability for enforced disappearances in Egypt. And it's really important to emphasise this is a Truth for Giulio campaign and justice for enforced disappearances in Egypt. We're not singling Giulio out. We're not saying somehow that because he's a British resident Italian, he somehow merits any more attention, thought, concern or consideration than the hundreds of others in Egypt who experienced a similar fate to him. But what we do know, and I'm sure most of you in this room will be familiar with, is that in Amnesty's methodology, focusing the spotlight on real individuals and the plight experienced by real people can help to humanise and bring a much wider picture vividly to life. So the campaign began really in Italy. Very soon after Giulio's body was discovered, Amnesty Italy, working extremely closely, and there is a duty of care here with Giulio's family, launched a major campaign in Italy. And that campaign had a very strong impact very quickly because the Italian government refused to confirm the location of the ambassador that they were due to send to Egypt. And that's still the situation today. There is no Italian ambassador in Egypt. And the campaign in Italy was nationwide, very visible, very prominent, focused, I think, perhaps a little too much on Giulio rather than the wider picture, but it was certainly very impactful. In the UK, the campaign originated in Cambridge. Giulio's, of course, own community. And in Cambridge we saw very early on an extraordinarily powerful alliance between the Amnesty City group, the Amnesty student group in that city, and in particular local trade unions, including the NUJ and the University and College Union. And that campaign and the rallies and demos that took place garnered support the local MP and certainly a lot of visible local publicity. So when I took on the cases as case manager, we wanted to look at how we might be able to replicate some of those relationships that we had seen locally working so effectively in Cambridge. So the plan we came up with, and this is for this phase of the campaign, I can talk perhaps about what we might be doing later, was this collaboration between our trade union network and our student network, working in partnership with the University College Union, focused on action on campuses. So it's a campus collaboration. And this campaign, because of course students and academics end up getting caught in exam cycles and so on, this phase of the campaign was launched in February and will continue until May. In May we will then review and revisit where we've gone, and we will develop new initiatives and new activities. And it's important to emphasise that in terms of this campaign, even if there are any prosecutions in Egypt, it would be an utterly extraordinary thing to happen. Because the reason the state gets away with the repression with the intensity that it does is because there is universal impunity. So if we were to get to the point, and it's a big if still, where potentially members of the security forces are investigated, that would be utterly exceptional. Were they to be put on trial, that would be utterly exceptional. Were they to be found responsible, that would be entirely unprecedented. But even then, from Amnesty's point of view, that would not be enough. We would insist that not only those responsible for the crime of torture against Giulio are held accountable, but also those in the state that facilitated the system that allowed that crime to take place must also be held to account. Those that gave the orders must also be held to account. Those that turned a blind eye must be held to account. So although a breakthrough in the case of Giulio would be utterly momentous, which is why we're putting so much effort into it, it in and of itself does not resolve the problem. It doesn't resolve the repression of the state. So clearly Amnesty's commitment is a long-term one, because the level of enforced disappearances has grown extraordinarily over the past 2 years. And in fact, I'd encourage you all to read the Amnesty report that was published last summer. It documents 1,100 cases of enforced disappearances, a substantial number of them affecting children. In many cases, those people that are subject to enforced disappearance aren't themselves considered by the agencies of the state to be responsible for any political crime or subversion. Sometimes they're relatives of people that the state wants to get hold of. In terms of duration of enforced disappearances, we have cases where people resurface within weeks, but we have many cases where they don't resurface for months and months and months. And regrettably, amongst the 1,100 cases, over 100 people died in detention. So although the death of Giulio was perhaps at the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of what happened, the plight of people subject to forced disappearance, is by no means unique, and the path that people travel through is thoroughly and well documented in that report. So what we're asking people to do on campus is two things. We're asking University College Union branches to come together with our Amnesty student groups on their own campuses. We're asking people to promote this action postcard. We're asking people to sign it on the back, and don't just take one for yourself and sign it. The idea is to encourage UCU activists and Amnesty activists to go out into the campuses and actively distribute these cards and actively promote that action. And so we'll be collecting these cards until the end of May. The campaign will officially end, this phase of the campaign will officially end in May, because the students will be engaged in exams after that. And then we will revisit the campaign over the summer with the idea of maintaining momentum, maintaining that visibility, continuing to mobilise, but we might do it in different ways and in different places. We know, for instance, the National Union of Journalists are very keen to work for us. So that's the first action. The second action that we're asking people to do on their campuses is to come together physically, perhaps in some prominent or picturesque location on their campuses, to get a group solidarity photo done with Truth for Giulio, and these placards are designed for that purpose. So as part of Anne and my road tour, we are encouraging all the audiences that we meet to join in and contribute to that photo action if you wish to do so. Some people are not photogenic, and some people may have security concerns, and if that's the case, please don't feel that you're under any pressure. So the intention is, with these action cards, they will be returned to Amnesty UK. And the reason we're asking them to come to us rather than going direct to the Office of the Public Prosecutor is that will then allow us to measure the take-up rate. And I'm hoping we'll have so many cards back, and it's down to you. I'm hoping you have so many cards back that the only effective way of counting them will be to weigh them. And we've had campaigns like that in the past. And then we will use all of those cards for some sort of embassy hand-in, embassy demo, in order to get an extra bite of the cherry. In terms of the photo actions that we're asking people to take, we're going to create a Flickr stream of all of these photos, and that can then be shared first with Giulio's family, which will be a gesture of solidarity to them, but also will be a reminder to the Egyptian authorities of the degree of concern around enforced disappearances in Egypt. Now, the only other thing that I think I need to... two more things. The other thing is that for a year or so, Giulio studied at the UWC University in New Mexico in the USA. The UWC is a global progressive university, and Giulio's fellow students in the UWC have come together to set up a fund to sponsor Egyptian students to study at the UWC branch in Italy, which is close to where Giulio had lived. And in order to build the funds up for that scholarship, they got his friends had set up a Truth for Giulio Just Giving fundraising page. So if you're interested in making a contribution, those details are here. Final thing I wanted to say was, in terms of keeping up to date with the campaign, in terms of accessing our report, in terms of learning about future development, everything you need to know is on the Truth for Giulio webpage, which is www.amnesty.org.uk/Giulio. Couldn't be simpler than that. So if you keep a regular lookout on that, then you'll be up to date with the campaign activities. And this is maybe the 10th college event that we've done, and you know we're open to offers. Although I have to say this is certainly one of the most comfortable venues we've been in. And so, you know, as events unfold, or if we organise a demo to coincide with the handing of the postcards and so on, all that will be on the webpage. So That's just a little bit of background to the campaign. Thank you.
Okay. Perfect, thank you.